No one talks about this, but every time an avoidant loses someone, they pay a price. Now, it's not the kind of price that is immediately apparent. It's not even something they consciously recognize. Avoidants don't just move on. They carry the weight of every loss with them for the rest of their lives, but not in the way you think. Let's take a look at my avoidant death wheel for some context. Now, there are 8 stages to it, which you can see here. But really the stages that concern us are these ones right here. Stages 5 through 8. The avoidant decides to leave the relationship with you. They're so happy they left. They start to feel kind of lonely. Then they start to feel sorry for themselves and wonder why they can't ever find the right person, which of course leads them to starting the death wheel over again from the beginning. But there's something else happening beneath the surface that this graphic doesn't show. And if I'm right, it will change everything about our understanding of how avoidants operate. Now let's start with this book attached. On page 124, the authors Amir Levine and Rachel S.F. Heller introduce us to the idea of the Phantom X.
One of the consequences of devaluing your romantic relationships is that you often wake up long after the relationship has gone stale, having forgotten all those negative things that annoyed you about your partner, wondering what went wrong, and reminiscing longingly about your long-lost love. We call it the Phantom X phenomenon.
Now, one of the obvious takes that people have about Phantom X's is that avoidants often use them to ensure they can never get close to someone. But there's something that's always bothered me about this. There are usually 2 scenarios that people think of when they think of Phantom X's. The first scenario is one where the avoidant crafts a story about their perfect ex where the relationship wasn't fully realized because it ended prematurely. Now, usually this relationship ended before the Phantom X's flaws could surface, often because the avoidant was dumped early on. In this case, the avoidance defense mechanisms haven't yet activated because there was no depth, intimacy, or commitment. In the avoidant's mind, their ex remains blemish-free. Therefore, the ex is that perfect candidate to be a Phantom X. And then, of course, there's scenario 2. This is a medium to long-term relationship that was objectively good and healthy, proven over time despite many flaws. This relationship was self-sabotaged by the avoidant after several months or years. The avoidant can look back and acknowledge that they were responsible for the breakup. Now, on paper, this ex was an excellent communicator and tried to meet the avoidant's needs. Initially, the breakup felt refreshing to the avoidant as they achieved space and security. However, after a few months, when the levels of intimacy naturally drop, the avoidant looks back and realizes that their ex had the whole package as a partner. Okay, so here's my hot take, and I promise we're going to get to the price that they pay. I think these 2 scenarios about Phantom X's are mostly wrong. They do happen sometimes, but I think the way a Phantom X is built is never about a particular X like the 2 scenarios that were presented earlier. It's about a need that isn't currently being met. A need that was met from an X from the past, or was potentially in retrospect to be met with them. I mean, think about it for a moment. You're an avoidant. You're in a new relationship with a woman named Carla, and things seem to be going great until Carla asks if they can keep a toothbrush at your place. This is an immediate threat upon your independence. It's code red. So in your brain, to keep Carla distant, you think of a previous ex you had, one that specifically never asked to keep a toothbrush at your place. Gina was her name. Gina never wanted to keep a toothbrush at your place, and that comparison game continues throughout the relationship. Carla wants to move in together now. Wait, that's a problem. Gina wanted to move in together. No, I can't use Gina anymore. I know, Helga. Helga never wanted to move in together. Poor Carla can never measure up to anyone because the Phantom X isn't made of one specific X. It's made up of all the best parts of all the other X's, as attached notes on page 125.
This fixation with a past partner affects budding new relationships because it acts as a deactivating strategy, blocking you from getting close to someone else. even though you'll probably never get back together with your phantom ex. Just the knowledge that they're out there is enough to make any new partner seem insignificant by comparison.
So an avoidant jumps from relationship to relationship, remembering and taking the very best parts of those relationships, forgetting and discarding the worst until they've created this almost Frankenstein-like phantom ex that they can call upon at any point during any new relationship as the ultimate deactivation strategy. But there's a catch. The more they do this, the more unhappy they become. You see, existing within every avoidant is a paradox. They want to be close to someone, to fall in love, to have that happily ever after, but they don't ever let anyone truly close enough for that to happen. Now, part of this can be traced back to their childhood. It's naturally assumed that almost all attachment theory stems from how a caregiver treats their child in their upbringing. Take a look at this. This is a quote I picked out from the Attachment Project. During this formative period, a child's caregiver may have been emotionally unavailable to them a lot of the time. They may have also disregarded their child's needs by not responding to their cues and behaved in a rejecting manner. So imagine this. You have a year-old infant whose only way of steadying their emotions is with a caregiver. Anytime there's a problem, the infant cries, hoping that the caregiver solves the problem and steadies their world. But the caregiver doesn't do that. Instead, they respond to the infant by essentially rejecting them. Now, what does this reinforce? Well, it reinforces the fact that the infant needs to learn how to care for themselves. Independence. And you can actually see this play out on an extreme scale in orphanages. There's this great article written by this woman named Sarah Salmon in the Sydney Morning Herald detailing her adoption journey and her visit to a Cambodian orphanage. After deciding against biological children due to challenging fertility treatments, Sarah and her husband Ben decided to adopt and sought to give another abandoned child a home. The article describes these emotional and heartbreaking scenes at the orphanage.
There is no point in crying. They know no one will come for them, so they shut down. They carry a morbid moroseness. It's the loudest silence I've ever heard.
And this is an important point about avoidance, one that I feel is completely overlooked by a lot of people. The need for love is present. It's there from the very beginning. When a new baby enters an orphanage, it starts out by crying. The baby cries and cries and cries because he or she knows they need to rely on others to survive, to live. They need love. Love is human. Every baby instinctively understands it. But when that baby doesn't get immediate relief, they learn to be quiet, to be self-reliant. And that self-reliance often impacts them all throughout their life. It's 1989. After the fall of Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, the world discovered the dire conditions of 170,000 children in Romania's impoverished institutions. As this situation gained international attention, researchers Nathan Fox, Charles Nelson, and Charles Zana saw an opportunity to study the long-term effects of early institutionalization on these children.
The babies laid in cribs all day, except when being fed, diapered, or bathed on a set schedule. They weren't rocked or sung to. Many stared at their own hands, trying to derive whatever stimulation they could from the world around them. Basically, these kids were left on their own.
Starting in the year 2000, Fox, Nelson, and Zana began evaluating 136 children from Bucharest's institutions. Half of these children were randomly assigned to foster families, while the other half remained in institutional care. The children's ages ranged from 6 months to nearly 3 years, with an average age of 22 months. Over the next few months and years, the trio conducted follow-up assessments on both groups. They also evaluated a control group of local children who had never lived in an institution.
Institutionalized children have delays in cognitive function, motor development, and language. They show deficits in socio-emotional behaviors and experience more psychiatric disorders. They also showed changes in the patterns of electrical activity in their brains, as measured by EEG.
This was in direct contrast to the children who grew up in foster homes.
Foster children showed improvements in language, IQ, and social-emotional functioning. They were able to form secure attachment relationships with their caregivers and made dramatic gains in their ability to express emotions.
While foster care produced notable improvements, children in foster homes still lagged behind those who had never been institutionalized. Some foster children showed better outcomes than others, with those removed before age 2 making the most significant progress. Fox notes,
"There's a bit of plasticity in the system, but to reverse the effects of neglect, the earlier, the better."
The researchers used structural MRI to explore brain differences among the children. They discovered that institutionalized children had smaller brains, with reduced volumes of both gray matter and white matter.
A history of institutionalization significantly affected brain growth. Children who transitioned to foster care regained some white matter volume over time, but their gray matter volume remained low, regardless of stable homes. These brain changes correlated with a higher risk of ADHD symptoms.
Fox goes on to end with this really haunting statement.
Children need to be in socially responsive situations. I personally think that there aren't good institutions for young children. This is a worldwide public health issue.
So clearly what Fox is trying to say here is that neglect from a young age pretty much impacts someone throughout their entire life. They normalize a lack of love when it really shouldn't be normalized. Are you familiar with the concept of Yin and Yang? It's an ancient Chinese symbol that represents the duality of life, with opposing forces that are interconnected and interdependent in the natural world. The yin, the dark side, and the yang, the light side, are not only opposites, but also complementary forces that create a balance. Well, this yin and yang concept is probably the best visual representation that I've found to be able to describe the war that's brewing internally inside an avoidant. You have the yin, the dark side. This is like an avoidant's insatiable need for independence, this ultimate self-reliance born out of neglect. And then you have the yang, the light side. This is like the yearning for love and reliance on others. Now, according to the yin-yang philosophy, you're always trying to put these two things into balance. They're opposites, but they can coexist. And I think this ideal appeals to individuals who are avoidant. But from the get-go, the avoidant has only really ever known yin. They've only ever really existed with a dominant dark side. So that's all they've ever known from birth. The dark side has always won out. And I mean, imagine that for a moment. This nagging thought that you have to do things alone, by yourself. You can't rely on others, but the need for love, the light side, the yang, is always there. It's the subtle tug that offers an avoidant a brief respite in the darkness. And that's sort of how I view their relationships. Let's go back to that avoidant death wheel for a moment to play this out. Look at stage 2. I've found someone, my troubles are over. This is the yang, the light side, poking through. This is the one moment in time where the light side starts to gain momentum over the dark side, but it's fleeting. And what happens during every romantic relationship they embark on is they have this constant push and pull. This internal conflict perpetuates their cycle of loneliness and self-sabotage. And the longer they exist in this state throughout their lives, the more the dark side takes root, the more it hollows them out from the inside. I mean, you literally see it play out with the Phantom X Frankenstein phenomenon I was talking about earlier. They aren't viewing relationships as relationships with people anymore. They're viewing relationships as these brief moments in time where the darkness wasn't in total control. They got a taste of love. But inevitably, the programming of years of defense mechanisms kick in and the dark side begins to take over. And that's the true tragedy of their plight. They're stuck in this continuous cycle of unfulfilled relationships and lingering regret, trapped in an eternal struggle between their need for independence and their desire for connection. And it really does make you wonder, are they always destined to end up alone? Well, left to their own devices, yes, they will. They'll experience brief moments of happiness and subsist within those moments. But that doesn't mean there's no hope for someone who is an avoidant. A few months ago, I was interviewing Erica Comazar, a licensed clinical social worker who specializes in childhood attachment. And she said something that I thought was rather insightful.
A relationship broke it, and only a relationship can fix it.
And if you think about it, it does make sense. You have a baby crying, desperate for a caregiver to provide love, warmth, and closeness. But that doesn't happen. Instead, the baby learns to self-soothe. They shut down and to rely on themselves for emotional stability. This initial break in the relationship between caregiver and child sets the stage for an avoidant attachment to develop. The child grows up believing that they cannot depend on others for emotional support, and this belief carries into their adult relationships. This is a classic case of cause and effect. The cause, a lack of nurturing and responsive caregiving during a critical developmental period, and the effect, an adult who struggles to form and maintain close, intimate relationships. The cause was relational, so it stands to reason that the effect can also be addressed relationally. Erica's insights kind of highlight this perfectly. A relationship broke it, and only a relationship can fix it. The damage done by an absence of early emotional support can be healed through consistent, reliable, and secure emotional support in later relationships. For avoidance, the path to healing involves entering relationships that provide the emotional safety they missed out on as children. These relationships can help rewrite the avoidant's internal narrative, gradually replacing the belief that they must be self-reliant with the understanding that they can trust and depend on others. But this process is not straightforward. The avoidant has to be willing to confront their deeply ingrained fears and defense mechanisms. Their partner must exhibit immense patience, understanding, and stability to provide a new, secure relational experience. And here's the rub, the thing that everyone's too afraid to tell you. If you're sitting here watching this and thinking, I can be that person for the avoidant, I can change them, that's not necessarily the best ideology to start with. I did this video a few weeks ago where I talked about this idea of a solar system and what I see happen a lot of times with individuals who get swept up into an avoidance orbit. So here's you, a planet stuck in someone else's solar system. And here's the avoidant. They're kind of like a dying star. Now, if you're not familiar, when a star dies, it goes through these pretty wild stages. It sort of balloons up and becomes a red giant, changing in size and shape, swallowing up surrounding planets until it eventually loses many of its outer layers, and then it shrinks to become a white dwarf. And then finally it fades out, becoming a black dwarf. All right, so back to you. You're here, a planet orbiting the avoidant. You're trying so desperately to fix their problems, to be that healthy relationship they need to become more secure. But more often than not, this is what happens. The dying star of the avoidant expands. It swallows you up, and that's pretty much the game. The point I'm trying to make here is that you don't fix an avoidant by jumping into their solar system and allowing them to swallow you up. Why though? Well, doing that sort of corrodes your own solar system. Without you there to maintain your own planets, they get consumed by the chaos. What this often leads to is a loss of your own identity and emotional health as you become more enmeshed in different solar system issues. The key is not to orbit someone else's solar system. It's to maintain your own so that you don't lose your identity, so that you maintain your sense of self. You can offer support, but you need to keep a safe distance to avoid from being swallowed up. This means setting boundaries, prioritizing your own emotional health, and recognizing that you cannot change someone who isn't ready or willing to change themselves. By maintaining your own solar system, you create a healthier dynamic. One where the avoidant actually sees what a stable solar system looks like. They see what a stable relationship looks like. And most importantly, they don't feel the pressure to change or fix themselves overnight. It's about showing them that it's possible to be connected and interdependent at the same time. And it's about showing them that relationships don't need to be a threat upon their independence. It's a delicate balance, but one that can truly lead to healing from not only the avoidant, but also you.